Now that the tong blanks are done, I'm going to start working on shaping the bits. Wolf jaw tongs have notches cut into the sides of the bits that allow them to be used as ring tongs, and they usually progress in size from larger to smaller. Sometimes these notches are fullered in while the bit is hot, but for the shape that I'm making today with the fairly narrow V-bit tongs, you pretty much have to cut them in. If you started hammering a bar or a fuller into the sides of this, you'd get a lot of distortion and it would really make a mess. I'm going to be laying out the position of those notches by simply using a hacksaw and cutting in 3 grooves into the sides. In order to get an even spacing in the finished bit and to have the 3 different size notches that I need, I have to start by placing the saw cuts with an uneven spacing. I'm going to have a largest notch at the back, so that first saw cut's going to be in from the back a little bit. The next one's going to be a little bit off from the center of the bit, and the first one is going to be fairly close to the front of the bit. From here you can remove the waste with the file if you want, or use the hacksaw to cut out the notches, but I usually find it easier to just take out the side grinder and with the cutoff wheel. It does a very accurate job and you have a lot of control that way. Here you can see how I've gone ahead and ground the inside face of the bit to create a sloped surface. This not only changes the size of the side notches that I've cut in, but it also changes the size of the main notch that I have for the V-bit tongs. So this is going to allow me to grab a variety of bars, both lengthwise and crosswise. Here I'm just transferring the location of the notches to the other bit. Once again, I'm going to be marking the location of the notches with a hacksaw, only this time I'm not going to be making the saw cuts to the full depth. I'm just going to mark the surface and then compare this bit with the first one that I made. If I need to move the notch over slightly to get things to line up, I can easily do that because I haven't committed to, a very deep saw cut. If you make the saw cut to the full depth, then you need to move it over slightly. It's going to be a lot harder to do a neater job because the base of the new notch may not line up with the base of the saw cut. So you may wind up with kind of a ragged, finish to the bottom edge of the notch. So it's better to just mark the surface, and if you need to make a new saw cut to realign the notch so that it matches up with the first bit that you made, then that's easily done, and you're not going to be committing yourself to the final location of that notch. Once I'm satisfied that I have the notches lined up with the first bit that I made, then I just go ahead and saw them full depth and proceed the way I did with the first one. And here are the two halves ready for assembly. I'm just using a straight piece of round bar as the rivet, and the length of the rivet is determined by adding up the two halves of the tongs together and then adding in the amount that you need for each rivet head. And the standard for that is usually about 1.5 times to 1 3/4 the diameter of the bar stock that you're using. And you need to add that to each side, obviously, because you're making two rivet heads. When I make tongs, I always drift the hole for the rivet slightly undersized, and that means that I need to drive the rivet in place. That locks everything in position, and I don't have to worry about anything sliding around when it's in the fire. Everything works as a unit. When I'm setting the rivet, I always use a very light hammer and I work very slowly at the beginning. I want to make sure that the rivet is being upset evenly and that it stays in the center of the tongs. That is, I need to make sure that there's the same amount on each side of the tongs to make the rivet head. If it drifts off center slightly, one of the rivet heads is going to be larger than the other. If you need to recenter the rivet, you can place the tongs over the pritchel hole and drive the long side into the tongs. That'll recenter the rivet, but you need to do that fairly early on. Once your rivet is fully formed, it starts to deform the tongs if you try to center it at that point. Now that the rivet is set, I'll move to a heavier hammer and start shaping the actual rivet heads. And the last thing that I do before I free up the rivet is do any final shaping that I need to do to the tongs. The last step in the process is to shape the bits and to make sure that they're properly aligned in the tongs. The first thing that I need to do, which may not be obvious from this video, is that I need to crank the bits over so that the tapered sections of the bits are sitting parallel to each other. So the drawing on the right shows how the bits should align when the jaws are closed. Once I have the jaws lined up so the faces are parallel to each other, I'm going to take the largest bar that I intend to use with this pair of tongs and I'm going to size the jaws to that bar. When you're setting up this bar stock, you also need to think about the amount that you need to close the reins to be able to grab onto the smallest bar stock that you want to hold with these tongs and the largest bar stock that you want to hold with these tongs. So when you're setting up the max size, you want to make sure that you have a fairly open grip with the reins, and that'll give you the room to close the tongs enough to grab the smallest bar that you want to use with this pair of tongs. Once you have that range of motion set up, the shape of the jaws will kind of take care of the rest and it will allow you to hold a variety of bar stocks.